She took our savings. My mother-in-law gambled it all. You didn't expect betrayal to come from within your own home. Not from someone you greeted with a smile every morning. Not from someone who once kissed your cheek like a mother. But here you are, standing in front of the computer screen, your bank account open, and your breath caught midair. The numbers don't make sense. It was supposed to be $38,000. You both counted it saved, it lived frugally for it. That money was meant for the down payment, the little house you and your wife had dreamed of. Now it's $12,000 and dropping. You scroll through the transactions with a trembling hand. $5,000 withdrawn on Monday. $4,800 2 days later. Another $3,000 just yesterday. Transfers to an account you don't recognize. Until you look closer, the name faint but unmistakable. Her name, your mother-in-law. And for a moment, everything stills. The sound of the kettle boiling fades. The voices outside your apartment door gone. All you hear is your own heartbeat and a single thought pounding in your head. Why would you confront your wife that night? She sits on the edge of the bed, hugging her knees, disbelief clouding her eyes. No, she whispers. She wouldn't do that. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe she just needed it for something important. She wouldn't steal from us. But it's not a mistake, and you both know it. When you check again, the login password to your bank account has been changed. The recovery email, the one you shared with your wife, was used to reset it. And you remember how a week ago your mother-in-law had offered to help your wife book flight tickets for a cousin's wedding. She'd asked for access, just for a second. It was enough. That night your wife cries herself to sleep. And you sit at the kitchen table staring at the last $12,000 in your name. You remember every late shift, every skipped coffee, every weekend. You didn't take off because you had a goal, a home, a future. And now it's in a stranger's hands. No, not a stranger. That's what hurts the most. It's someone who sat at your table, ate your food, blessed your marriage. You look around your apartment. It suddenly feels colder, smaller, and a bitter thought creeps in. If this is what family looks like, what does betrayal even mean anymore? You thought you were building a life with love. But tonight you're left with silence, and the deafening truth that sometimes the deepest wounds don't bleed, they echo. You remember the street you moved into. It wasn't much. A row of modest duplexes, sun-faded mailboxes, and the occasional barking dog behind rusted gates. But it was your beginning. Your wife called it humble. You called it ours. You'd just gotten married. New furniture still smelled like the store. The fridge was half empty, but your hearts were full. And right across the alley, your mother-in-law, a widow with weary eyes and a voice that could turn sweet or sharp depending on the day. She welcomed you with warm soup and tepid smiles, called you son, even when you still felt like a stranger. It was nice, almost too nice, but you wanted peace, harmony. So when she dropped by unannounced or rearranged your kitchen without asking, you smiled and said nothing, until the neighbors started talking. She's back at it again, you know. I saw her outside Lucky Palace last night again. Poor woman. After her husband passed, gambling became her only escape. You heard the whispers in stairwells, laundry rooms, even while walking to the car. You brushed them off like flies. People always talk. And besides, she never seemed reckless. She never asked for money, never looked desperate. That's how trouble hides best, doesn't it? Not in the loud, but in the quiet. You remember one afternoon, you and your wife were fixing a leaky faucet, laughing at how neither of you knew what you were doing. Your mother-in-law stood in the doorway, smiling. Then she said, half joking, "You two better save every penny. With rent and weddings and kids, the house dream might stay a dream." You thought she was teasing, but her tone had a strange weight to it, a touch too bitter, a touch too knowing. Then came the little things. A borrowed scarf that never came back. A jewelry box shifted ever so slightly. That one time your cash envelope was short, but you blamed yourself. You're being paranoid. You told yourself, she's family. But families have cracks, and cracks let in shadows. Now sitting in the same kitchen, those memories return with clarity you never had before. The things you ignored, the warnings you laughed off, the instincts you silenced. You look out the window toward the alley. The air feels heavier, as if the whole neighborhood always knew something you didn't. As if their silence wasn't ignorance but mercy. And now they're not whispering anymore. They're just watching. Because even when you try to keep your pain private, in places like this, nothing stays hidden. Not for long. Sometimes the only way to silence doubt is to follow it into the dark. You didn't want to go, but one evening you did. A coworker had mentioned a place behind an old karaoke bar, barely legal, definitely familiar to people who like to disappear. He said, if she's still at it, that's where you'll find her. So you drove, not because you wanted proof, but because part of you already knew. You just needed to see it so you could stop pretending. It was raining, the kind of soft, steady rain that turns city streets into mirrors. You parked across the alley, turned off your headlights, and waited. And there she was, your mother-in-law, umbrella crooked in one hand, oversized purse clutched in the other. She looked smaller than you remembered, older, but her steps were purposeful. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look around. She knew the door code. She'd done this before. You followed, heart pounding, mind racing. The entrance reeked of cigarettes and spilled beer. Inside, the lights were low, the air stale with despair. A dozen tables, flashing machines, faces empty and hungry, people laughing too loud, too fast. And there, in the far corner under a flickering light, she sat, stacking chips, eyes locked on the dealer, hands trembling, not from age, but adrenaline. You didn't move. You didn't need to. Because the truth wasn't just sitting across the room, it was clawing through your chest. This wasn't a slip. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This was a habit, a life, a lie. You watched her lose, then double down, then lose again. And when she pulled out a folded envelope, your envelope, you turned and walked out. You drove home in silence. No music, no headlights, just the rhythm of rain and betrayal. When you stepped into the apartment, your wife was folding laundry. She looked up, and without a word she knew. You sat on the couch, stared at your hands, and told her everything. At first she didn't speak. Then she said something you'll never forget. Maybe what she doesn't know how to stop. And you realized this wasn't just about money. This was about someone drowning slowly and dragging everyone down with her. You both cried that night, not just for what was taken, but for the trust that would never return. And for the painful truth that love doesn't always mean safety. Not when it's poisoned by addiction. Not when silence becomes complicity. Not when the shadows have names you once called family. You thought once was enough. That maybe losing the savings had taught her something. That maybe, just maybe, she felt remorse. But addiction doesn't recognize remorse. It only recognizes silence and opportunity. Weeks passed. You and your wife tried to move on. You cut back on expenses. Took on more hours at work, ate out less. You told yourselves, we can rebuild, we still have each other. But the house was no longer a home. It was a battlefield with no shouting, just long pauses, sleepless nights, and eyes that no longer met across the table. Then it happened again. This time it wasn't savings. It was your rent, your emergency funds, gone just days before the landlord came calling. You confronted your wife in the hallway, voice, trembling, hands, shaking. She looked terrified, not of you, but of what it meant. So you searched. You pulled bank statements, looked at timestamps, and there it was. Another transfer. Same account. Same name. You sat down on the couch and stared at the floor for what felt like an hour. Your hands didn't shake this time. Your heart didn't race. It was something worse. A stillness so heavy it felt like grief. She did it again. And worse, she knew she could. You heard the door creak. Your wife walked in. Eyes red, voice barely a whisper. I didn't know she still had access, but you already knew the truth. It wasn't about access. It was about boundaries that were never set. And now, you had nothing left to give. That night you stood in the kitchen staring into the dim glow of the refrigerator. The silence was deafening. The kind that only comes when love has been pushed too far. You thought about your father, how he once told you, being a man isn't about how much you can carry. It's knowing when to put something down. You were carrying too much, and what was breaking wasn't your wallet, it was your spirit. You looked around at the place you once filled with dreams. Now it was filled with fear, and you realized you weren't just losing money. You were losing yourself. So you made a decision, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but because some lines once crossed cannot be redrawn. No more, you whispered. Not in this house, not to my wife, not to me. Tomorrow you would call a family meeting, not to start a fight, but to end one, not to punish, but to finally protect, because forgiveness without change is just permission in disguise. You planned it like you were planning a farewell. A simple dinner, nothing elaborate, just rice, vegetables, and grilled chicken, her favorite. Your wife helped prepare the table in silence. Neither of you spoke much, not because you were angry, but because you both already knew. Tonight wasn't about eating, it was about truth. And truth, when served hot, never goes down easy. She arrived just before 7, carrying a tray of dessert she didn't make, wearing perfume you hadn't smelled since the wedding, trying to make the evening feel normal, comfortable, familiar. But the air was heavier than the food. Even the candle flickered like it knew. You sat across from her. Your wife sat beside you. The plates were full, but no one picked up a fork. You were the first to speak. "We need to talk." Her smile froze. She placed her napkin down. And just like that, the game was over. You laid it out, transaction by transaction. Account numbers, password logs, IP addresses, dates, times, amounts. You spoke with no anger, no trembling, just a kind of quiet heartbreak that comes from being betrayed by someone who was supposed to protect, not plunder. Your wife reached into the drawer and pulled out a folder. Inside, printouts. Proof. This time she had helped you gather them. When you finished, there was a long silence. The kind that makes you wonder if hearts really do break out loud or just collapse in silence. Then she laughed, a soft, bitter laugh. "You really kept track of all that?" You nodded. She shrugged. "You wouldn't understand. You've never felt what I've felt, that itch, that need." Your wife, eyes glassy with tears, finally spoke. "But why? From us, Mom. From your own daughter." There was no answer, just more silence. Then came the words that made your skin crawl. "You're young, you'll earn it back." As if the years you sacrificed didn't matter. As if your pain was refundable. You stood up, not in rage, but because sitting in that chair felt like agreeing. And you could no longer agree. "This is the last time you'll have access to our lives," you said. "You can stay, or you can leave, but you won't take anything else with you." She didn't yell, didn't beg. She just pushed the plate away, grabbed her purse, and walked out the door. No slamming, no theatrics, just a quiet exit into a darker night. Your wife cried, not for her mother, but for the innocence that had just left the room with her. You didn't hug her. You didn't need to. You simply sat beside her in the dim kitchen and let the silence settle like dust on a closed chapter. And for the first time in weeks, you felt clean. It didn't happen overnight. Healing never does. But weeks passed, then months, and somehow the silence began to feel less like a punishment and more like peace. You moved. Not far, just across the city, but far enough that her shadow couldn't reach your doorstep anymore. The new apartment was smaller. 2 rooms, no balcony. But the air was different, cleaner, lighter. You painted the walls together, hung up curtains that didn't quite match, bought secondhand furniture, and laughed when the couch made a squeak every time someone sat down. It wasn't perfect, but it was yours, free from intrusion, free from fear. There were nights your wife still cried, not loudly, just the kind of quiet tears that come when someone realizes their definition of family has changed forever. You held her, not with answers because there were none, but with the kind of silence that says, "I'm still here. We're still here." One afternoon, you found an old envelope in a moving box, the same kind you used to hide cash in. Inside, nothing but dust and a small note your wife had scribbled months ago. For the house, for us. You stared at it for a long time, and instead of sadness, you felt something else. Gratitude. Because not all pain is meant to be carried. Some of it is meant to be laid down, so you can walk forward lighter. Your mother-in-law never came back. Not to visit, not to call. Word from a distant cousin said she'd lost everything again, and was living in a motel outside the state. You didn't feel triumphant. You didn't feel pity. You just felt distance. And sometimes that's all healing needs. One day, as you and your wife sat on the new couch, drinking cheap wine and watching the sunset paint the window golden, she looked at you and said, "Thank you for staying." You smiled, not because everything was fixed, but because you had both chosen to begin again, not with wealth, not with perfection, but with truth. And in the quiet that followed, No tears, no yelling, no broken trust. You realized peace doesn't always come when everything is solved. Sometimes it arrives when you stop waiting for apologies and start building something no one can steal again. Not even family,